Welcome to the Unhurried Living Podcast. We're sharing leadership conversations to help you develop unhurried rhythms of rest and work. We're helping you overcome hurry and make time for what matters most. And now, enjoy today's episode. Hey friends, welcome to episode 270 of the podcast. My name's Alan, and as always, I'm so glad you've joined me here. It is my hope that this episode will help you rediscover an unhurried way of life and leadership. Now, I've been a reader of the New Testament for 45 years now. I'm still grateful for the wisdom and life guidance I find in those pages. Checking my current favorite NIV Bible, I realized that the New Testament takes up only about 225 pages. Actually, that's about the length of many of the books I talk with authors about on this podcast. What I mean to say is that the New Testament isn't as big as I sometimes imagine. And I realize that I can easily get stuck in habits, even ruts, when it comes to how I understand what I'm reading in these pages. So that's why I'm so glad to share my recent conversation with Dr. Scot McKnight about his recent translation of the New Testament called the Second Testament. In reading through familiar passages in it, I found myself challenged and awakened to the New Testament in quite a very helpful way. I really do think you'll find that what he shares about this translation today is going to be very life-giving to you. Now, Scot McKnight serves as Julius R. Manti Chair of New Testament at Northern Seminary in Lombard, Illinois. He is the author of many books, including Reading Romans Backwards, Pastor Paul, The King Jesus Gospel, and commentaries on James, Galatians, and 1 Peter. He is also the co-editor of the Story of God commentary series and general editor of the forthcoming second edition of the Dictionary of Paul and His Letters. Now, if you're new to the podcast, welcome. I'm so glad you found it. And if you haven't already, I encourage you to subscribe. And if you would, talk about this podcast with your friends and colleagues. Meanwhile, let's now dive into my conversation with Scot McKnight. On today's Unhurried Living podcast, I'm pleased to have Scot McKnight as my guest, and we'll be talking about his New Testament translation called the Second Testament. Scot, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
I've looked forward to the opportunity to have this conversation. And I'd love to start by asking if you'd share a story of your journey in taking on, a monumental task like translating the New Testament.
Yeah, most don't realize what a task this is. Yeah, it's a lot of work.
Oh my.
Okay, I was a fan of Tom Wright's translation called The Kingdom New Testament.
Yes.
And he wrote that as a part of his project, The Bible for Everyone. Mm-hmm. The commentaries are little daily devotionals.
Yeah.
And then I heard that to complement Tom's work, the publisher had negotiated and contracted with John Goldingay to do the Old Testament like that. Mm-hmm. I actually have never seen one of the little commentaries or the little daily reflections of John. So I was curious about his translation, and then they came out together as a Bible in England, in the United Kingdom.
Okay.
Called the Bible for Everyone. And so I bought it, had to get it shipped from England, I believe. And I started reading it. I wasn't that interested in Tom's translation because I already had a copy of that.
Yeah.
And so I started reading Goldingay. And I remember thinking, this is not the same.
Oh.
What Goldingay had done to the Old Testament is not at all what Tom had done to the New Testament. So it really struck me as odd that they published them together because they had two completely different theories. So at an academic meeting, I saw the main editor for InterVarsity, and I made this observation that the two don't belong together. And it just so happened that at InterVarsity, they published Golden Gay's Old Testament, First Testament, but they didn't have rights to Tom Wright. So they couldn't bring them together.
Okay.
So I told the editor, and he said, "What do you think should be done?" I said, "Well, I think you guys ought to find someone to translate the New Testament using the same theory that Golden Gay had done, because I really like Golden Gay's translation. It was a fresh reading of the Old Testament to me. I've read it now almost 3 times."
Yeah.
So he said to me immediately, his name is John Boyd. He said, "Would you do it?" And I said immediately, "Yes." and I thought, okay, now what have I gotten myself into? So I spent pretty much 5 days a week for 2 years, just translating the New Testament and editing the translation. So it's a lot of work. And every mistake, we find these little mistakes. Every one of them bothers me because it's the Bible.
Of course. Man.
Yeah. So
could the stakes be higher, I guess?
Yeah, that's right. So there's the story of the translation.
Well, I appreciate that. And so it's sort of implicit in that is that, every Bible translation has a reason for being. Tom Wright's has a particular place of focus. But then you described reading John Golden Gay's First Testament and really being impressed by or drawn to it or appreciative of it. I wonder if you can share a little bit more about your own priorities or values that guided this particular translation and why you felt we needed a New Testament version that paired well, I guess, with John Golden Gay's First Testament.
Yeah, that's the right word. It paired well. And it was based on the theory of Golden Gay. So it's not like I believe that the theory that I used is the right theory. I mean, I know that the others are called dynamic equivalents as a general rule. In other words, they try to find an English expression that is as close as possible to the Greek expression or the Hebrew and Aramaic expression.
Yeah.
So that it really sounds like English. Golden Gay tried to make the Bible a little less familiar and a little bit more clunky so that it was more on the extreme side of what's called a formal equivalent. So it sounded like Hebrew. For instance, he transliterated names. And if anyone has looked at John Golden Gay's First Testament, the names can get kind of long and you go, well, I'm glad we've got an English equivalent.
Yeah,
but
I had that experience.
There is something really distinct about seeing an equivalent of Jacob instead of James in the New Testament, Yaakov or Yaakobos. That has a different evocation for a Bible reader than James, because it sounds like Jacob of Genesis, which is what it's supposed to sound like. So there was a transliteration and it was clunkier. And then when I began to work on this, at first I was trying to do what Golden Gay did, but I found myself converting Greek into Hebrew at times and trying to use the Hebrew equivalent. And I thought, no, this is not what we're doing here. I had to translate the Greek rather than, let's say, a rough Hebrew equivalent. So I used Ioannes, not Yohanan, for John, and I used Jesus, not Yeshua, for Jesus.
Right. I see.
So it had to be the Greek expression, and then Greek is different than Hebrew. So there's, at times, people will read the translation of the Second Testament of my translation, and they'll say, that's really clunky. It doesn't quite sound right. And I'll think, I win. It is making you, this is what I tell my students and audiences who ask me about it. And that is, when I make you go to your English translation, your familiar one, to see what you think it said, I've won. We've both won. We're both thinking about the same text in a more careful way. So I hope that that's the kind of common experience as people read the Second Testament.
Well, as I read some familiar passages, because I'll admit I didn't read the entire Second Testament before our conversation, but I did go to some familiar ones. And what you're describing is what I experienced. What I realized is, I hate to quite say it this way, but it's almost as though I imagine the New Testament's an American document written in English rather than a Middle Eastern document written in the everyday Greek of that time.
That's right.
I lose touch with that reality, and the work you did and have done helped bring that alive for me again. It pressed me in some ways I needed to be pressed, I think. Mm-hmm. Was that part of what you were hoping for?
That is exactly what it is. And it is not, I want to take the Bible out of the familiar Bible reader's hands and say, try this now. Yeah. And see what happens to your reading of the New Testament that you're familiar with, to see if it sharpens it, blunts it, shifts it, transforms it. Yeah. And I think all those can happen with a more literal, more formal reading, translation of the New Testament, of the Second Testament.
Yeah. Well, so in reading some of your introductory comments, one of the things you said is that you sought to minimize the transformation from Greek to English. And I see that in the simpler English words that you use, or the fewer, that's a better word, the fewer English words you use as compared to, as you said, the dynamic sort of translations. Can you say more about that, minimizing the transformation from the Greek?
Well, I had the Gospel of Luke open. It's not as easy. All right. There is something in Greek called a genitive absolute. Okay. A passage will begin, it's not always the beginning, but most of the time, with a genitive absolute expression, formal, and that is a form, and that is, there will be like a subject and a participle. But the subject of the participle is not the subject of the verb of the main sentence. Now, I know that's a lot of English grammar for people. Okay. But when most of our translations translate that, they don't. Okay, now I called it a genitive absolute, which means it's really a suspended clause because the subject of the participle is not the subject of the next verb. So Mark chapter 5, verse 18, I have, he's boarding down into the boat. 3 dots, ellipsis. The one demonized begs him. Now, that's how it reads in Greek. But normally, a typical dynamic translation, I'm guessing the NIV has, when or as he was getting into the boat, the demonized person or the person with demons begged him that he might be with him. So they will make it smoother, and they'll just tie it together as a simple introductory clause. It's not that simple. It's a suspended clause. It's sort of like, I want you to know this is what's happening, but now I'm going to change that to this is what's happening. I think our English translations make the transition too smooth to feel how the Greek feels. I don't know if that's too much of an explanation or not.
Well, so part of it is the way that you've done the translation work. In part, you want us to feel what it would have perhaps felt like for someone in the first century to hear these words. Most of them would have heard them read aloud, I'm sure.
That's right.
That somehow we might feel some of that too. And it kind of gets to that. Yeah, that my point earlier, that I realize how often I just assume these are American documents, which then, of course, I bring all my American values and assumptions to it. That's the familiarity thing I think I hear you talking about, that where familiarity can breed contempt, it can also breed unhelpful assumptions.
Yeah. It distances, the translation will distance us from our language and attempt to take us back to another language. And it's, I think, I don't know if you're still preaching every week, but it's not really a pulpit Bible. You can use it in the pulpit, but if you read it aloud, like I've read it to my students aloud, and they're kind of going, oh, I didn't quite follow that. That's it's meant for people who know the Bible, who know the New Testament, and are looking for a stimulation of their reading of the New Testament. And I hope it'll give it to them. So I do distance it from modern day English.
Yeah. So maybe a good way to ask this question would be, many of our listeners are in a weekly preaching situation. They're pastors or they're Christian leaders who work with the text of the scripture a lot in their ministries. What are some ways in which you could envision someone benefiting from this Second Testament in the various ways that they engage the scriptures?
Well, I get letters. It's not every day, but if I add up Twitter and Facebook and Threads and everything else, I probably hear from someone almost every day. And most of them are pastors, teachers, and they will say, what you did in, let's say, Mark chapter 5, verse 1, really gave me a new insight. So as you're preparing to teach or preach, I would hope that this translation could be read along with your regular one as a way of, let's say, challenging you or destabilizing your understanding or surprising you. I think there are sometimes surprises.
Yeah.
And, it's less religious. I avoid, just like John Goldingay, I avoid theological jargon. So much to the chagrin of perhaps some of my Presbyterian friends, I don't use the word justification or justify. And it's not because I don't think those are good words. It's because they're so loaded with theory and theology and history that people see them and they filter them immediately through their systematic theology. So I use the word right or to make right, to write as a verb, R-I-G-H-T. So it's a distancing. And what I find is that people who are reading it find it to be a stimulating addition to their already existing reading of the Bible. Yeah.
So again, one of the things I hear you saying is that it challenges our assumptions. Well, it surfaces them first.
Yes.
Because most of the time they're just sitting there in the back of our head, not examined very well. But that's what I experienced in reading some familiar passages, is that it surfaced my assumptions and then pressed me to ask some questions about those assumptions. Are they serving me as well? Or do they help me understand the text as well as I thought they were?
Yeah. One of the experiences that I felt with Goldingay and readers of my translation have written to me about, and that is they'll read a verse and they'll think, I don't think I've ever read this verse before. And then they'll go to their translation, they'll go, I've read that a lot of times. I've got it underlined. That's the sort of defamiliarizing that I think it shakes things up a little bit, and maybe at times a little too much for some people. But I'm not trying to replace anybody's Bible, anybody's translation. I'm trying to stimulate the translation they have and provide an alternative, less familiar way of doing that.
Yeah. And so another thing I think I'm hearing you say is, for many of us who've been engaging the text for, let's say, decades, that the scriptures have been a big part of our whole adult lives, this may be especially helpful for that one because of the fact that it gives them a chance to see this text that they've maybe read many, many times in a very approachable, easy to read, dynamic sort of translation. They're having to rethink something they thought I already know that. John 3:16, I already know that.
Yeah.
I got all of this figured out.
Yeah,
maybe not.
That's right. It will do that. Speaking of John 3:16, let me read it. Oh, I just opened to it. That's pretty rare. For God loved the cosmos, all right, in such a way that he gave his only son, so everyone trusting in him may not be destroyed, but have eternal life. I think people will go, oh, that's not what I memorized in my King James Version.
I don't think I ever heard Billy Graham preach that one.
He never used the word destroyed or talked about eternal life. The eternal life is my translation for eternal life, because the emphasis of the Greek word aionios is not foreverness, but pertaining to an era. Now, the era is the eternal era in a sense. So therefore, era life is eternal life. But the emphasis is not on how long it lasts, but that it belongs to this very specific period in the plan of God in the future.
Yeah, I love that. Well, and again, as you say, there are a number of points at your translation that I have to ask myself now, what does that mean? How does that work?
Good.
How does that impact my experience of God in the invitation of Jesus, in that little spot?
Yeah.
I like that. Well, so as we are engaging the New Testament as a document guiding our journey with God, the Gospels as a way of how do I walk with Jesus? How do I work with Jesus? How might this translation stimulate, do you think, that formational journey?
Well, I think the first thing that I would say is we need more Christians who are reading their Bible often.
Yeah.
So I would say whatever translation you use, if you're reading it often, we're doing better.
Yeah.
So for those who need a jolt in their Bible reading, the Second Testament can jolt them into an alertness and a paying attentionness that they probably haven't had since they read the Bible the first time or a book the first time. And the second thing is, I just think it will make them think about the text. It'll slow them down because it's unfamiliar and because it's clunky or chunky, as my editor called it.
Yeah.
And when they are slowed down in their Bible reading, they will be paying a little bit closer attention. And then they will ask questions like, is that the best way to translate this? Why is McKnight's translation different than my translation on this? And what difference does it make? And I think that is what most people who read the translation will experience.
Yeah, I could see that. I could see how when I'm reading a familiar translation, I can easily skim over the surface of it.
Yes.
I know these phrases. I know these lines. John 15 has been a place, vine branches. Like, I think I know exactly what that means because I've lived with it for so many decades. But then to read yours, some of even the words are different and the metaphor is poised differently. And it really pressed me for a passage that has meant a great deal to me to think deeply about, yes, but what does that actually mean in my continuing journey, this connection to Jesus that he uses a metaphor to describe?
Mm-hmm. Well, I was just going to say something, and now I forgot what I was going to say. Well, okay, here's what I was going to say. I grew up memorizing the King James Bible. That was the Bible we memorized. I think it was easier. I know this as a fact from learning about languages. It was easier to memorize the King James Version than it is today to memorize the NIV because the language was so distinct that you had to concentrate. When the language sounds just like everything else you've got and you hear, it's harder to memorize. And many people today who memorize struggle. I don't hear as much about Bible memorization today as I used to. But the NIV is harder to memorize than the King James because it's so familiar. And so I think my translation would actually be helpful for Bible memorization as a process because it's going to be peculiar and people are going to think, oh, wow, how do I remember that? But it's because it's odd that it is easier to memorize. So the familiarity of it allows us, and you've said the right word, we can skim it because we're so familiar with it. It's when you get 3 words into one of my verses, translations of verses, and you go, what is coming next? that you can't skim it anymore. And that's a good thing.
Well, the name of our podcast and of our nonprofit is Unhurried Living. And this is one version of Unhurried we need to cultivate, which is to slow down more to the pace of reflection and deep thinking rather than a kind of quick skimming, I already know what this means kind of reading that some of us get into the habit of doing. Well, as we close our conversation, I would love to give you one more chance just to speak to our listeners, invite them into this translation you've completed, and just to engage it. Any words of encouragement or?
Yeah. Let me just say that no reading of the Bible, no opportunity to spend time in God's Word will go unwasted if we, let's say, clear our hearts and minds from all our anxieties and just read the text and read the Bible. I believe reading the Bible aloud can be profitable because it slows us down and we hear it. Then we have two senses operating. And I also believe that reading the Bible in different translations is a way of making us think about familiar things in fresh and new ways. So I would invite people to read the New Testament, to try the Second Testament, try it on, and I think you will find that it will stimulate your reading of the Bible. I want to emphasize that I'm not trying to correct anybody's translation. When I speak in churches, I don't use my translation. I use the translation that those people are using. And then I simply clarify things at times and don't even mention the Second Testament. But every now and then someone will say, well, what translation were you using? So I think it will be a stimulating contribution and discipline in your life to read a passage in your familiar translation and then try to read it in the Second Testament.
Yeah, well, I can certainly say that that's been true for me as I've engaged the work you did.
Well, thank you.
Well, and so again, today my guest has been Scot McKnight, and we've been talking about the Second Testament. Scot, it's really been a pleasure to have the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan.
My wife, Jim, and I wanted to take a little time, as I told you right up front, to share our experience with this new translation. So welcome back to the podcast, Jim.
Yay. It's fun to be here again.
It's been a little while. It's nice to have you back.
So I thought it would be good.
Yeah, start by, share some of your experience with reading in this translation.
Yeah, I thought it would be good for us to have this chat just because we both had a chance to sort of peruse some of our favorite passages and see what was up. And so maybe just to give a more personal touch on your conversation. So
yeah,
a lot of the things I'm going to share actually come from my thoughts based on, he has like a 3-page introduction to the whole book, right? So it's very concise, but it's full of so much just insight into what he was trying to do. And I just found it really fascinating. So in the really beginning, he was saying, he used the words awkward, choppy, and crunchy. And I loved it because that's how I talk, just trying to come up with ways to describe what it was like. And it just set me on this whole, I knew this, but he awakened me again to the fact that the Bible was lived by people from a completely different time and culture and language, which again, I knew that, but his translation really keeps us aware of that. And I think that's important, because I have my own worldview. I make all kinds of assumptions when I see certain words. I basically have come up as a middle-class American, which is very different from the time of Jesus, Jewish person, right? And then the Bible, as we know, the New Testament, or he calls it the Second Testament, was written in Greek. So all of this is very, quote, foreign to me. I enjoy that and actually welcome that as a refreshed way to engage the Bible, sinking into what people, how they might have thought, how they might have spoken, what they might have meant.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So in that way, can you imagine going to a publisher and say, I'd like to make a translation. I think its key features will be awkward, choppy, and crunchy. I don't know. I don't know too many publishers who go, yeah,
that's so good. Well, I remember the first time when it came to us and I opened it up and I read it. And my first impression was, this is weird. I mean, because it sounded foreign to my ear as far as the way the sentences are even constructed. So again, this is actually a promotion for the book. I'm not trying to put anybody off here. I welcome this new way. I like it.
Well, that's actually my point, which is to say, when I read, I opened it to some familiar favorite, passages, and it didn't read easily. And like you, I was a little disoriented by that at first, but the more I lived with that chunkiness, fewer words than I'm expecting, fewer transition words, a lot less Englishy. That was actually one of the things he said, is he was really trying to create an English translation that felt like the Greek language, which is what the Bible's written in. It wasn't written 20 years ago in American. It was written 2,000 years ago in the common Greek of the day, the business Greek. But I really find that to be an asset. I mean, like, that's a feature of it. Yeah. And so reading some of those familiar passages and having them sound so very different from the translations I'm used to reading, I think exactly what Scott hoped would happen is what happened for me. I had to think about a passage I would have read right on through and zipped on to the next passage.
Yeah. Well, both of us, I think we've both been Christians for more than 40 years.
Yeah.
And so again, how many times have we read the Bible, heard it in sermons? And like you, I have favorite passages and they're very familiar. I have a lot memorized. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. That's beautiful and it's a gift. And it's nice to have a little bit of a startle, a little bit of a wake up. So that's how I felt. The other thing that I noticed, what he mentioned was that he was trying to assume the reader's intelligence. And I think also the connection that we have with the Holy Spirit to help guide, our way, which I assume is exactly what he did when he was doing his work of translating.
Yeah.
And it's a translation that doesn't prioritize dynamic equivalent, which you're the one with the MDiv. Maybe you could tell us what that is just for, but I appreciate that. So maybe say something about dynamic equivalent and how this is not that.
Yeah. So I think Scott talked a little bit about this in our conversation, and there's a range of, you could say, translation theories. Some translations, I mean, think all the way to something like the Message or the Living Bible, are just really trying to make this as understandable in common English as is humanly possible.
Yeah.
That is generally dynamic equivalence. And then there are other translations that really mean to be much more literal, as much as possible, kind of word for word. It almost always takes more words in English to translate something in Greek over. I mean, there are much fewer words in the Greek, which is why when you read Scott's translation, there's a lot of times where there just doesn't feel like there's quite enough words to understand what he's saying. So he really went all the way out to the end of literalism to try and get at the meaning and to be faithful to that original Greek text. One of the ways he put it is that a lot of translations try to explain by adding more words so that it's more Englishy and it makes more sense in English. But he said, rather than explaining through his translation, he simply wanted to sort of portray. And so at the question of meaning, like you said, he's trusting that the reader will listen to the voice of God's Spirit speaking through this rather literal translation.
Well, we do that anyway, right? No matter what translation we're reading, we are applying our own intelligence, and we're always applying our own bias, whether we want to admit that or not. I mean, we all have a baked-in worldview, a baked-in bias that's very unconscious. But again, we've said it now, but at least twice. I find that to be the benefit of this version, having this alongside all the other versions that you have.
Yeah. Well, so talk a little bit more about your experience of this translation and maybe sort of this whole matter of the vocabulary that Scott chose to use rather than a religious vocabulary that's sort of common to us as American Christians. He sort of goes a little bit of a different direction.
Yeah, this was another idea that I did pull out of the introduction, the preface. And he said the first generation Christians were trying to they used routine words in a new worldview. They were thrown into a new worldview because Jesus died and then rose, right? This is a whole new way. And now we take it for granted because it's in the past and we've believed. They were right there. And so imagining myself in that, I only have the words that I have that I know to use right now to describe this miracle, this way that I've been wakened to. And I just think that's another interesting thing about what he's doing is trying to use their own words because he's using their own language. So one of the examples he gave was Luke was a doctor. Most of us know that.
Right.
And so when he writes a book, he's going to write a different book than the other guys because he actually has probably a different vocabulary as someone who's medically trained. And so in the original, he used the word edema, right? Because he's a doctor.
A medical diagnosis.
And so there's nothing wrong. Edema is swelling. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing wrong with using the word swelling. So someone like me can just know what in the world he's talking about. But I wonder if it's okay once in a while to be sent to the dictionary.
Yeah.
So again, this may or may not matter to people whether or not the word edema or the word swelling is there. But because we are talking about how different of a translation this is, I think it's worth noting that, again, Scott is trying to be faithful to the words that the people actually used. So if Luke's a doctor and he's talking about swelling, he's going to say edema.
Yeah. Well, so, another place where you notice, to say it's jarring, another place I noticed this is he does not Englishize personal names or place names.
Right.
He transliterates them. And so you have to think a while about who or where he's talking about when you read it, like Christ is Christos. Jesus is Jesus, it's so they sound Greek instead of sounding English. And so again, you just have to lean into that. But I thought, to your point, it feels more like a document from a long time ago than a document that somebody wrote a few decades ago. I wonder if maybe one way we could kind of close our little conversation is for both of us to share something, just literally a little reading from his translation that we found intriguing or helpful or whatever.
Yeah. I do want to add to what you just said before I move into my verse. There are parentheses, so you don't have to hurt your brain too much. Every time he puts the Greek version of the word in parentheses, right next to it is the word we would normally use, so you can know if it's Jesus or if it's Paul or John.
That's helpful to say.
But it is fun. Like even Israel it looks like Israel, but there's a Y in front of it. There's a Y in front of a lot of the words. I noticed. So anyway, I just wanted to say that so people would realize that they will know who's there.
Yeah.
But the verse I chose was Colossians. It's two verses, Colossians 3:14 and 15. Okay, so here's how it reads in the Second Testament. On all these, love, which is completeness's bond. Let Christos's peace umpire in your hearts, to which also you were called in one body. Be thankful. Now just see, each sentence just has its own punch. Instead of give thanks from your heart or whatever, it just says, be thankful.
2 words. Yeah.
Yeah. And then all these love. And then just completeness is bond. I mean, he uses words that are words I never use. Completenesses. I never said that before. But the word in this passage that actually really struck me was the word umpire. He's saying, let Christos's peace umpire in your heart. And so, of course, that word for me, I don't know what it meant to them. I don't know if they played baseball back then, but for me, when I hear the word umpire, I go straight to the baseball field. And then I'm picturing, what would it be like if peace was my umpire, right? Calling the shots, right? Like, that's out of bounds. What else does an umpire say? Oh, that's safe, right? Or he goes safe.
Foul ball.
Foul ball. Yeah. You're out. I mean, I know we can laugh about this, but for me, it took me into a place that felt very life-giving. Like, what would it be like for me to allow peace to umpire my own heart, to call the shots? In another way would be to encourage me to embrace certain things or to let go of certain things. I don't know. I just love the word umpire.
Yeah. Well, I'm pretty confident I don't remember reading the word umpire in the New Testament translation anytime recently. I was actually drawn, you had mentioned that passage to me, so I went to the beginning of that chapter because that's a favorite passage for me, those first few verses of Colossians 3. So this is how it sounds in the Second Testament. Therefore, if you have been co-raised with Christos, pursue upper matters, where the Christos is sitting at God's right. Think about upper matters, not on the land matters. For you died, and your life has been hid with the Christos in God. Yeah. So, even as you're listening, you have to think a lot. But I love that Scott uses the phrases instead of things above and earthly things, which is what NIV does. That's how I've got it memorized. Scott translates these upper matters and on the land matters, which I guess is about as literal as you can be in moving the Greek into English. It just made me really think.
Yeah. I mean, even when you're reading it out loud, don't you notice that you have to slow down?
Oh, yeah.
When I'm reading this, I have to read slowly, which I think is actually very on brand with Unhurried Living.
Yeah.
Maybe this version is a way for us to slow down and linger over the scriptures and to take it in afresh.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, maybe the last thing I'll say is I would encourage our listeners to get yourself a copy of the Second Testament, use it as a companion to whatever translation you prefer to use in your personal study or that your church happens to use in a worship setting or whatever, and let it companion. Like if you're reading a particular passage in the Gospels or in one of Paul's letters, give yourself a few extra minutes to read it again in this more literal translation and see what nuances it helps you capture, what assumptions in your understanding of it that it exposes. So I think it's a great companion for study or for even devotional reading. So again, I think Jem and I both would say we encourage you to take advantage of this new resource. We have found a lot of benefit in it.
Yeah, I agree.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation as much as I did. In the remaining 2 episodes of this fall season, I'll be talking with author Barbara Peacock, and I'll be sharing the final installment on my series about rest titled The Good Work of Soul Rest. I can't wait to share those 2 remaining episodes with you. Now, if you'd like more help in cultivating the unhurried way of life and work we talk about here on the podcast, I'd like to invite you to consider our training process called PACE. It's a certificate in leadership and soul care. It's the most robust training we offer. In it, we'll help you grow in your spiritual leadership perspectives and skills, whatever your role of leadership might be. This is a 21-month process involving in-person retreats and Zoom gatherings with mentored learning and practice between. There's never been a better time to give focused attention to your own spiritual life so you can help others do the same. To learn more, go to unhurriedliving.com/pace. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to the Unhurried Living podcast. Join us next time to learn more about following the genius of Jesus' unhurried way of life and leadership.